Okay, so in this video, let's discuss accounting procedures for specific types of non-profit organizations. Ayan. Starting off with private colleges and universities. Okay, so the primary objective of a college or a university is to provide educational services to its constituent. And so the objective of accounting for colleges and universities are to show the sources from which resources have been received, okay, so from the donors or fund donors, and to demonstrate how those resources have been utilized in meeting educational objectives. Yan. So, colleges and universities, mini-maintain pa rin nila yung account nila on an accrual basis. Okay? So, reporting income when earned and expenses when incurred. Expenses are reported by function, and as with other NPOs, okay, it classify net assets, revenues, expenses, gains, and losses based on the presence or absence of a donor-imposed restriction. So, kagaya lang ng ibang NPOs, yung mga revenues pa rin, gains and losses, still, it is classified as to the presence or absence of a restriction imposed by an external, the external source of those resources. Unrestricted ba yun? Okay, temporarily restricted or the permanently restricted net asset. So, how to account for revenues ba in private colleges and universities? Using the following three major groups, so meron tayong three major groups in accounting for revenues. Okay, so ano ba yung mga revenue groups na yon? Una, you have the educational and the general revenue groups with accounts for so dito mabilong yung mga revenues relating to student tuitions and fees, government appropriations, grants and contracts, and gifts and private grants, endowment income, and those other sources na hindi na mention dito but still related to educational and general revenues of the private college or university. The second one naman is would be the auxiliary enterprises revenue. So yung mga auxiliary revenues, yun yung mga revenues ng private colleges or universities not related not related to its goal, providing education. Yan. So, for example, itong mga auxiliary enterprises revenue would be, for example, pag meron silang mga dormitory sa school campus, so yung income nila or yung fees mako-collect nila from students or from the faculty with regards to the rent sa mga dormitories, and that would be part of the auxiliary enterprises revenue. And last is yung mga expired term endowment revenue. Yung mga endowment na yung restriction niya is nag-expire. Ayan. Pag na-expire na yon, part yun siya ng another type or another class of revenue group. Ayan. So the most common classification of expenses in private colleges and universities is by function. Ayan, so educational and general expenses. Okay. So yung mga expense function natin would be those for educational and general expenses and auxiliary enterprises expenses. So sa ating mga educational or those expenses that belong to the educational and general expenses function, ito yung expenses related to instruction, research, public support. So, example doon is yung mga seminars and conferences, academic support, student services, ayan. So, yung academic support natin, ito yung sa mga libraries and or mga museums, ayan. And operations and maintenance of plant and student aid. So, the second one naman is yung auxiliary enterprise expenses. So, again, ito yung mga expenses not related to the goal, of the existence of a college or a university. Ayan. So, contributions are defined as unconditional transfer of cash and other asset, okay, to the entity, or a settlement or cancellation of liability in a voluntary non-reciprocal transfer. Yan. So, yung itong contribution or definition of contribution, ito din yung definition of contribution with other types of NPO, no? Yung mga unconditional transfer. Ayan. Without or of cash and other assets, no, to an entity, and or kapag merong liabilities na sinettle or kinancel, okay, in a non-reciprocal transfer. Okay. For conditional pledges naman, it depend on the occurrence of uncertain future events. Okay, so yung mga pledges is, ito yung, kumbaga, there is a promise, no? There is a conditional promise, okay, depending on the occurrence of uncertain but future events, and are only recognized as revenue when the conditions are substantially met. So the pledge becomes unconditional. Ayan. So in this case, magmamaterialize lang yung pinramis, ng isang would-be resource provider kapag yung condition specified in the pledge is substantially met. Okay? Only such time na yung condition maging or yung pledge maging unconditional. Now, a receipt of unconditional pledge is recognized as follows. So, kapag naka-receive ka ng unconditional pledge, okay, so syempre, kailan mo siya i-record as revenue? You will record revenue for pledges at the time of the receipt of the pledge or of the promise by debiting contribution receivable and by crediting revenue, unrestricted contributions. Ayan, debit, credit yan. And doubtful accounts expense, allowance for doubtful contributions. Ito naman yung entry na ginagawa natin kapag, syempre, yung contribution natin receivable. So, if we can estimate, no, na some of the amounts, no, sa ating contribution receivable would be considered as uncollectible, then set up tayo ng doubtful accounts expense for such receivable. So, donor-imposed restriction and reclassification. Remember that we reclassify, no, those net assets classified as temporarily restricted to unrestricted kapag the donor stipulated time has elapsed. No? Kapag ang donation of such resources is accompanied, no, by a temporary stipulation or temporary donor restriction, donor-imposed restriction. Okay? And pag nag-elapse na yung time or nag-lapse na yung time, then it should be reclassified to unrestricted net asset. Next naman is donor stipulated purpose has been fulfilled. So kapag yung donation naman of those properties, okay, ay restricted, okay, for a particular use or purpose, kapag nagamit na siya for said use or purpose, then kailangan mo na siya i-reclassify from, again, temporarily restricted net asset to unrestricted net asset. And over the useful life of a donated asset, if, for example, yung mga long-lived asset natin, if a long-lived asset is donated or a cash is restricted for the acquisition of a long-lived asset, okay, such resources should be classified, of course, initially as a temporarily restricted net asset. And gradually, re-reclassify natin siya towards unrestricted net asset, no? Over the useful life of such asset. Ayan. So to illustrate, a 9,000 pesos contribution of restricted cash by a donor for a specific item when received is recorded as debit cash, syempre credit, revenue, temporarily restricted contribution. Kasi it is restricted, no, by the donor for specific item only. Okay? Now, expenses of 5,000 that are in compliance with donor restriction are funded by the restricted resources. So, na-meet na niya yung or part of the 9,000 received, okay? Pag naka-incur ka na or si university ng expenses related to the 9,000 restricted contribution, and syempre, you'll have to record expenses, okay? Debit expenses, credit cash for the said amount, and a corresponding reclassification from temporarily restricted to unrestricted net asset. Remember, as what we have discussed no in the previous video, yung expenses natin can only be recognized in the unrestricted net asset portion. Kaya kahit yung expenses is related to a temporarily restricted net asset, we'll just have to reclassify the related asset from the temporarily restricted net asset classification to the unrestricted net asset classification, along with the recognition of the corresponding or related expenses. Ayan. So, what are the funds ba in the private colleges and universities? So, meron tayong current or operating funds. Siyempre, yung current funds natin or operating funds natin, it could be unrestricted or restricted. Okay, it is unrestricted when it's used on the day-to-day activity of the college or university and available for current activities commensurate with the college university objectives without restriction. So, sa madaling sabi, kapag ang isang resource is unrestricted and is available for the day-to-day use of the college or university, then that would be considered to be a current fund unrestricted. Restricted naman siya kapag mayroong donor-imposed restrictions. Ayan. So, the next type of fund of a private college or university is a loan fund. It is used for making loans to students, faculty, and staff. Generally, it consists of grants from donor and income from endowment. So, may mga income tayo sa endowments na sasabihin ng donor na yung income na yun would be set aside as for loans to students or faculty and staff. Yung mga unrestricted loan funds, when the boards or trustees sets the policies of the loan funds. So, sabi natin in our previous video na kapag yung restriction or yung policies are set by people within the organization, for instance, ng Board of Trustees, still, it would remain to be considered as unrestricted. Magiging restricted lang siya when the policies of the fund are set by the grantor or donor or by providers from outside the organization. The next is endowment or endowment funds and similar funds. Okay? So, ano ba yung klase ng ating mga endowment funds? Okay? Ito yung pure or regular endowment funds. Okay? So, yung principal niya, hold by donor in perpetuity. Okay? Meaning, hindi siya nag-i-expire or as a regular endowment or pure endowment. Okay? It has to be kept intact. While the income naman for pure or regular endowment funds, it is permitted or it may be permitted to be expended for current operation. Ayan. The next one is the term endowment funds. Okay? Meron pa rin yung principal or income. Pero principal ng term endowment fund is expendable after a specified period or event. So kapag may time restriction or purpose restriction siya, then after which o pag na-meet or pag nag-lapse na yung time or pag na-meet na yung purpose, then such the principal of that term endowment fund may be expended. Okay? The income naman, just like pure or regular endowment fund, the income for the principal of a term endowment funds may be permitted to be expended for current operations pa rin. And the last is yung mga quasi endowment funds or tawag dito, ito na yung similar funds. Okay? Restrictions are made by college or university board of trustees making the fund unrestricted for current use. Kaya quasi endowment fund siya. Kasi yung mga endowment fund natin usually or technically, the restrictions come from donors outside the organization. Pero yung mga quasi-endowment funds natin, yun na yung mga investment ng university na yung policies ay ginawa ng people within the organization. Again, for instance, ng mga board of trustees ng university. Both principal and expense or income are expendable for the school's operation. Ayan. If it is a quasi-endowment fund. So, annuity and life income fund naman, annuity fund accounts for resources acquired to make stipulations or stipulated periodic payment to individual as provided with agreement with the donor. Ayan. So, pag mayroong resource na dinonate and the donor provided na an annuity payment should be made to someone, then such resource should be part of the annuity fund. Life income fund naman, if the requirement of payment of funds income to is to a designated beneficiary. So kapag yung income naman, yung income ng fund na yun is for a designated beneficiary, usually until the death of the beneficiary. Yan. Makaka-receive siya ng income payment from that fund. The last one naman is our plant funds, account to be used for capital assets, for resources to be used to acquire capital assets or to retire indebtedness related for capital asset. So dito na papasok yung ating mga fixed asset funds sa ating or sa plant funds ng private colleges or university. Now let's illustrate the journal entries, some of the journal entries per fund classification. Ayan. For current fund, if it is an unrestricted current fund, we have here transaction and the corresponding journal entries. Okay, so educational or revenue is earned or billed, student tuition and fees, of which 24,000 pesos is doubtful. And so merong tuition daw, student tuition and fee for 2,040,000 pesos. Meron ding CHED scholarship grant na 900,000. Merong endowment income 60,000 and other investment income for 300,000. Okay? These transactions being classified as unrestricted for current fund. So the journal entry would be a debit to accounts receivable. Okay, syempre add mo siya lahat. That would be equal to 3.3 million. Okay? And credit revenue, student tuition and fees, that 2,040,000. Revenue, CHED grants, dahil walang particular or specific restriction as to how the grant from CHED is being stipulated. Sabi dito, scholarship grant, kaya it is also considered to be an unrestricted current fund. Okay? For 900,000. Another one is itong ating endowment income, for 60,000, that's revenue, unrestricted endowment income, 60,000, and the other investment income for 300,000, it's income, unrestricted, other investment income, 300,000. And remember that meron tayong doubtful for collection, na part ng ating student tuition and fees. Kaya we have to set up a expense for the doubtful student accounts receivable, for 24,000 and credit allowance for doubtful student account receivable for 24,000. Next is a restricted cash is received to assist for library operations, yung mga academic support, yan, for 84,000. So, debit to cash and a credit to revenue, temporarily restricted contribution for 84,000. Okay, remember na meron siyang restriction. Okay, for library operation lang daw yung 84,000. Kaya, temporarily, we can say that it is only for temporary or it is a temporarily restricted contribution. Kasi once na nagamit na yung 84,000, or pag may related expenses na sa 84,000 na contribution for library operation, then pwede na siya i-reclassify into unrestricted net asset classification. So income from regular endowment funds of 9,600 is restricted for student and aid activities. So dahil restricted siya for a particular purpose, kaya temporarily restricted siya. Revenue for temporarily restricted contribution at 9,600 and a debit to cash for 9,600. unrestricted contribution of interest income are pledged in the amount of 300,000, 10% of which is considered doubtful. Okay, dahil pledge yan, kaya that would be a debit to contribution receivable mo pa yun siya. Okay? Dahil unrestricted, of course, credit ka revenue, unrestricted contribution. That's 300,000. Now, dahil doubtful siya, 10% of which is doubtful, you have to set up a doubtful accounts expense and allowance for doubtful contribution. Still, for 30,000, that's 10% of 300,000. Now, revenue for 480,000 is billed for dormitories, 24,000 is still collectible. Ayan, so sabi natin kanina, no, siyempre yung primary reason of the existence of a university is to provide for instruction, okay, research, ayan, for learning, education. So, hindi kasali doon yung pag-provide ng dormitories to students or to faculty. Ayan. So, pag nag-provide naman sila ng mga ganoong services, that would be considered as their auxiliary services, no? So, dahil 480,000 yun is billed for dormitories, yan. Syempre, debit ka ng cash. Okay? 480,000. Okay? Although the entire 480,000 is revenue, dahil meron kang collectible na 24,000, so yung cash ma-receive mo is just for 56,000. The remaining 24,000 is remain or accounts receivable, okay? And of course, revenue for 480,000. The services rendered and are typically purchased if not donated. Okay? Fair value of the service is 42,000. So remember that as what we have discussed in our previous video, okay, if there are contributed services, okay, you will only record or recognize those contributed services at its fair value if, una, kapag yung services being contributed enhances the value of a non-financial asset. Pangalawa, if the services would have to be purchased if not contributed. Okay? So only in those two cases can you recognize contributed services. O dahil ito, sabi niya, kung hindi pa daw siya dinonate, bibilhin mo talaga siya, then you have to record or recognize the contributed services at its fair value. That's debit. Okay? Siyempre, corresponding debit yon, expenses instruction, 42,000. Credit mo yung revenue unrestricted contributions for the 42,000. Ayan. Now, for current fund, okay, restricted, okay, restriction must be from external party. Ayan. So, it comes primarily from government grants and contracts, endowment income, and private gifts. A sample transaction, expenses are paid except 4,800. Now, for library operations, 80,400, and for student aid, 7,200. Okay, so remember that itong transaction na ito, related to siya sa ating transaction dito. Ayan. The cash, no, received, restricted for library operation, 84,000. So, nagka-incur na daw yung university ng expenses related to that donation. And the expenses is 80,400, and for library operation yun siya, related sa 84,000 na contribution. And the second one is for student aid. So, the journal entry would be a debit to expenses and academic for 80,400. Expenses, okay, student aid for 7,200. Okay, that's total to 87,600. Dahil may 4,800 na hindi pa daw nabayaran, kaya accounts payable pa natin yun, 4,800. With a additional credit for cash, 80,000 to 82,800. Ayan. So dahil, okay, yung 84,000 or part of the 84,000 dito sa transaction na to, okay, dahil part of the 84,000 has already been used for library operation, kailangan na natin siya i-reclassify from unrestricted to temporarily restricted net asset classification to unrestricted. Okay? Ayan, so to reclassify the 87,600, okay, that would be reclassification out, debit 87,600 and a credit to reclassification in unrestricted, also for 87,600. Now, how about loan funds? No? So this is our fund category for private colleges and universities. No? To account for resources available primarily for loans to students, faculty, and non-teaching staff. Principal and earnings or income of the principal must be available for loan purposes to be part of the loan fund. So, magiging part lang daw ng loan fund yung isang contribution kapag lahat-lahat, the principal including the interest of the principal is set aside for loan as loan funds. No? So, kapag hindi daw siya, if only income, so kapag yung income lang daw from that gift or grant may be used for loan purposes, then the principal must not be in the loan fund but in the endowment fund. So kapag again yung income lang yung nasa dapat yung gagamitin or used for loan purposes, then yung principal hindi siya dapat kasali sa loan funds. Dapat nasa endowment fund siya, investment purposes. The income of which is used for loan funds. Ayan. So, sample transactions and journal entry. Okay, a contribution of 30,000 pesos is received from an alumnus mainly for loan to students. Debit ka ng cash, siyempre naka-receive ka ng cash for 30,000. Credit ka ng revenue, temporarily restricted contribution for 30,000. Okay? Temporarily restricted siya kasi it is restricted for a particular use, loans to students. Now, loan amounting to 28,800 was made to students. So, yung purpose dito, a part of the purpose of the contribution ng 30,000 pesos from the alumnus has been loaned to students na, amounting to 28,800. Siyempre, dahil na-loan mo siya sa students, it would be a debit to loans receivable, credit to cash. Okay? For 28,800 as provided. Now, you have to reclassify kasi nga na-meet na niya yung purpose for which it is contributed by the donor. So you have to reclassify it, okay, from temporarily restricted to unrestricted net asset classification. Now, cash received for 25,200, 24,000 principal and 1,200 interest. Yan. So ito related pa rin to siya sa loans receivable na 28,800. So debit ka ng cash for the entire amount 25,200. A credit of course to loans receivable kasi to apply ito the principal na 24,000 and revenue. Okay. May interest yung loans receivable na amounting to 1,200 kaya unrestricted na siya for 1,200. Anyway, yung ano naman niya, yung related net asset classification has already been reclassified to the unrestricted net asset classification. Endowment and similar funds, no? Yung endowment funds natin, meron siyang, as what we have discussed kanina, permanent, term, or quasi endowment. It is board designated endowment. So, example transactions, common stock with fair market value of 72,000 pesos and cash for 72,000 pesos are received as pure endowment. Yan. So, debit ka lang ng cash, debit ka ng endowment investment for 72,000 each. Dahil pure endowment siya, therefore, its principal is kept intact or it is held in perpetuity. Yan. Magpabilin yan siya sa permanently restricted net asset classification as long as the university or the college exists. Yan. Kasi it is that of a pure endowment. Yan. So, revenue permanently restricted contribution. Total, that's 144,000 credit. Term endowment for 24,000 pesos has expired. So, mayroong term endowment daw na 24,000 na na-expire. So, reclassify mo lang siya. Reclassification out debit, reclassification in credit for 24,000 pa rin. Yan. Now, endowment investment carried at 240,000 was sold for 212,000 pesos. So, meron tayong endowment investment na dispose, no? The carrying amount of which is 240, nabenta for 312. So basically or technically meron tayong gain dito, net gain on the disposal of an endowment investment. Earnings from the investment is 48,000, so merong earnings sa investment. 24,000 is restricted for research projects, while the remaining is unrestricted. So the journal entry would be a debit to cash, siyempre 360,000. Paano kinuha? The 312,000 proceeds from the sale of the endowment plus the 48,000 income from such endowment investment. Okay? So that's 360,000 cash. Credit ka for the endowment investment, the carrying amount na 240,000. Credit revenue unrestricted. Okay? For the this is for the gain, no? Okay? Na 72,000, that's 312,000 selling price less 240 na carrying amount, that's 72,000. Gain na siya. It would be unrestricted na. Okay. And another credit for revenue, temporarily restricted, okay, for the 24,000 as imposed, and a revenue unrestricted for the remaining 24,000. Ayan, or from the 48,000 income of the endowment investment na nabenta. Now, agency fund. Remember, yung mga agency funds, ito yung kumbaga nagiging intermediary or agent lang yung college or university in handling, no, these funds. Kasi nga, it is intended for another person. So, nagiging pass-through lang dito yung college or university. Okay? Basically, the college or university does not really own those property. Kumbaga parang tinransfer lang sa kanya yung resources na yon para ibigay to third persons or transfer to another person or third person. Okay? So, transaction received 90,000 grant for student awards and the same amount was distributed to qualified students naman. So, simple. Dahil yung agency or yung properties received, no, and is classified to be as agency funds, liability mo yon. Okay? So, you have the liability of, taking good care of it. Okay? Ayan. So, debit ka ng cash, credit ka ng payables, 90,000. And dahil nagamit mo naman siya or napasa mo naman siya sa qualified students, so reverse mo lang siya. Debit, payables, credit, cash for 90,000. So, that is the or that are the some of the basic transactions or entries, okay, sa colleges and universities, classified to different funds, no. Ayan. So, as a result, if you sum up all of those transactions, ito yung magiging not all these transactions, kasi meron pa tayong mga transactions na hindi na natin in-include. And for illustration purposes only. Ito yung sample na statement of financial position, no? Dito sa University of Santo Tomas. Ito yung statement of financial position niya. Okay? So, same pa rin, merong asset, may liabilities. Pero yung net asset niya, classified siya into 3. Okay? So, unrestricted net asset, temporarily restricted net asset, and the permanently restricted net asset classifications with a total net asset figure. Okay? Pinakababa. Now, dapat itong mga net asset classifications na ito, it should reflect in dito. A statement of activities and changes in net asset. Ayan. So sa ating statement of activities or and changes in net asset, dito natin makikita yung mga revenues and expenses, okay, during the period, and the gain, the profit, the supposedly profit, no, sa ating profit of for-profit business organizations or business enterprises. Dito sa non-profit organizations, okay, it will reflect as a net change in the net asset, no, categorized into the 3 net asset classification. So, meron tayong mga revenue during the period, pero naka-classify siya as to what type of revenue ba yan, or yung revenue na yan, saan ba yan naka-affect? Sa unrestricted net asset classification, sa temporarily restricted net asset classification, or sa permanently restricted net asset classification. Dito naman, okay, our expenses. As you can see, no, mostly yung ating expenses talaga, generally, the expenses must only be recorded in the unrestricted net asset classification. Okay? Ayan. And last is yung ating sa cash flow, statement of cash flow. The same lang siya actually yung format na ginagamit niya sa for-profit businesses. Okay? Pero, ini-encourage ng standard na yung gamitin in computing the cash flow from operation or net cash provided by operation is dapat naka-direct method siya. Ayan. So that's it. That's pretty much the accounting procedures, the funds, different type of funds, the sample basic transactions and journal entry that may be present in an NPO, particularly sa private colleges and university. Yeah. So it's me saying, you can do it, we can do it. Peace.